1970s. So Henry Kissinger's worry was this, that the Filipinos will leverage the Mutual Defense Treaty to go for what Kissinger called self-aggrandizement moves, right? So what the Americans did was to come up with this so-called doctrine of strategic ambiguity, to say, yes, we are with the Philippines if there's an attack on them by a third party, but they never specified, where. For instance, they said in the Pacific. And then, of course, they also made it clear in multiple cables and in different ways, talking to the Filipino officials, that what you got, you stick to that, but don't drag us into getting other disputed land features, right? Because by this time, the Vietnamese, the Chinese, everyone was making a move. Now, that strategic ambiguity position was adopted all the way to President Barack Obama. So when Obama was in Manila 2014, we signed the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. This is just 2 years after Philippines and China have a naval showdown over the Scarborough Shoal. Philippines eventually was forced to cede that area to China because China just sent the whole armada there. And while we had to withdraw, we felt betrayed. We felt there was we were hoodwinked and the Americans were not there for us. But you see, we gave Americans more access so that they'll be more helpful to us and that we have more assurances. But Obama, when he was here in Manila in 2014, he said, we don't go to war over a bunch of rocks. He literally used the term bunch of rocks. And to make the insult more, more poignant, he even said, we have disputes with Canada, right? But we don't go to war with Canada over, rocks or something like that. So you could see that strategic ambiguity was holding all the way to the Obama administration. There was tremendous amount of disappointment. In fact, that's exactly why when Philippines elected someone named Rodrigo Duterte, I suppose folks are familiar with that person, he immediately seized on that and said, last time I checked, the Americans are not very reliable partner. But by 2019, Secretary Mike Pompeo, back then the U.S. Secretary of State, visited Manila shortly after the Kim Jong-un Trump's second meeting in Hanoi. And in a press conference and in public, he said any attack on Filipino troops, servicemen, public vessels, and aircraft in the South China Sea, so he was very specific about that, will activate the Mutual Defense Treaty. In fact, in 2019, in June or July, there was this incident in Reed Bank and other disputed territories when a Filipino fishing vessel was rammed by an alleged Chinese militia vessel. And back then, Sung Kim, the the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines, said even gray zone attacks by Chinese militia could be a ground for activation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. So you see this dramatic departure from decades-long ambiguity towards more strategic reassurance.
So what about now then? Do you believe that that is still in play?
So Biden basically adopted that. So Filipinos were like, okay, maybe Democrats are not as dovish as we thought. So we're generally fine with Biden. In fact, under the Biden administration, we further strengthened our cooperation with the Americans, including giving them 4 new ETCA facilities, that thereby Americans even having more presence in the Philippines and even deploying the Typhoon missile system, among others. And then comes the second Trump administration. Interestingly, when Hexet was in Manila, I was in Brussels, having conversation with think tanks and experts and officials there about your situation in Europe. And I know very well you have your issues with the second Trump administration. I don't think you need to watch J.D. Vance's speech or his meeting with, Alternative for Deutschland. We know it, that in Europe you have a very complicated relationship with the second Trump administration. In the Middle East, countries are also looking at potential changes, including vis-a-vis Iran, etc. But here actually in Asia, particularly in the case of the Philippines, what's interesting is that you never hear from any top Trump official saying the Philippines is not spending enough. Last time I checked, for instance, Elbridge Colby, who's the number 3 in the Pentagon right now, saying, you in NATO should spend 5% of your GDP, the Taiwan is 10%, Japan is 3%. They never said anything about that vis-a-vis the Philippines. The sense in the second Trump administration, I don't know about Trump, he hasn't said much, but as far as all his officials, key officials are concerned, is that there's an element of what I call strategic sympathy, which is, the Philippines may not have as much resources as you Europeans or the Japanese or even Taiwanese, but with the limited resources we have, we're really punching way above our weight. We took the Chinese to court in 2013 and won the case in 2016, and we paid the price for that. We got pressure, we got sanctions, we got all sorts of pressure and risk. Now, despite the fact that we don't have a big navy, our Philippine Coast Guard, and to a lesser degree also our naval forces, are at the forefront of what we call a transparency initiative, exposing what we see as bullying and illegal activities by China. And Philippines is practically the only country in ASEAN nowadays, no offense to Vietnam, which is openly calling out China and saying what they're doing is wrong and asking the international community to also censure China. So what I see with the Trump administration so far is this. they're not demanding the way they're demanding vis-a-vis you guys, and there's at least an appreciation that despite our limitations, we're doing the most we can. In fact, we are kind of an important frontline state, because the Philippines is not only important on the South China Sea question, we're also important on the Taiwan question.
Yeah.
So in short, there are ties that bind, and there's strategic sympathy. So weirdly, the second Trump administration is not creating much worry. If anything, people are quite happy with how the
Very
second Trump
interesting.
administration is treating the Philippines on this question.
Very
Yes,
interesting.
Very exceptional.